A lot of people, particularly Pentecostal, believe in the unction and the power of the Holy Spirit. And they believe that we should make room for the Holy Spirit to move through our preaching, and particularly when we are speaking. Now, I know very, very few pastors who can speak extemporaneously without any notes, right at the spur of their moment, who have been pastor in the same congregation for 20 years. Now, what I see is another thing that we need to discover and we need to realize, that the Holy Spirit is a planner. He can work as much in planning as in the occasion. For example, when the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit decided to create earth, God didn't suddenly make a decision. It was a premeditated act, and the Holy Spirit participated in this act of creation. And it was a planned thing. And he worked and created a beautiful world. Now, the same thing is that the Holy Spirit could be as powerful in our preparation as in the pulpit. And we need to give room, and we need to create an area for the Holy Spirit to move in. Now, talk about the re-experiencing of the text. Specifically, we are talking about God speaking to us. And this could happen from the epistles or the book of Revelation, the Old Testament or the New Testament. But more specifically, when we preach from narrative sermons or stories, not a parable, but a story. So I am going to zero in on narrative preaching, and everything now I say would modify the importance of preaching narrative sermons. Narrative sermons, talking about, say, you are preaching about blind Bartimaeus, which is a story, or the woman with the issue of blood, and subjects like these. Now, there are several advantages in preaching narrative sermons. First of all, Jesus preached narratives. He told stories and took sayings from the countryside and wherever he was, and used it as a springboard to teach about God. Now, very interesting, in our world, people who study speech tells us that we live in a post-literary culture. People are reading less, and that's why the internet, that's why television, and we see newspapers going down. Now, even in television, when you look at a movie, it is there's no point 1 or point 2 or point 3. It is a story that is being told and applied to the audience. How do we know? There's movement and there are different scenes to any part of the world, whether in literary West or in third world countries. These people have been accustomed to stories. Parents have told them stories, and they're accustomed of hearing stories, and they respond easily to stories that have been told to them. And so that is why I am suggesting that you might want to consider preaching narrative or stories from the Bible. Now, this is not all I talk about. When I deal with the different types of sermons, I will also deal with other types of sermons. And so we'll come to that sooner or later in our lectures. One of the other things about narrative preaching is that narrative preaching lends itself to the very spirit of Pentecostal preaching, where it allows us to move with the Spirit and to move the audience intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually to receive what God is saying and to come at the altar to receive what God is saying to a particular audience. I have found narrative preaching to be exciting and a wonderful part of my ministry. And whenever I preach narrative sermons, there are always people coming at the altar because they understand. The important thing in preaching is for people to understand what you're saying, to speak simply so that they can understand. Now, in a narrative, one of the ways to look at a narrative is to look at the experience of the person. And when you outline your sermon, you outline your experience. Would the person get the first point or the second point or the third point? That is not important. And usually the sermon has one point. And if they could get the main idea and you send them home refreshed with a word from God, you would have done the congregation good instead of wanting to get your so-called points across. So that would be probably the first thing I would say is to lend your experience. And I have an example of in the book of Joshua, chapter 14, of Caleb wanting Mount Hebron, and I have called this sermon Caleb Mount Hebron, God's best. And it's from Joshua 14, 6 through 15. And I outlined the experience very, very simply. And I try and apply it to the audience. So I stick with the text. I don't jump around. I stick with the text. Now, another way that we could preach a narrative is to come as a witness to the text. Is someone who have seen something. Now, we do not come as Paul or Peter who have been with Jesus. They saw the miracles. That's what a witness. A witness is somebody, for example, car accident, or who have seen something. But in this sense, we come as witnesses on behalf of the congregation to experience what God is saying through His Word to us. Another way to outline narratives is to outline the natural movement of it. For example, Paul's conversion in Acts 9, 1 through 22. We are outlining the natural movement. What happens in the text becomes in my sermon. So, the first thing that happened, we see here, is Paul is a persecutor of the church, going to destroy the Christians. The second thing we see is he has an encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus. He becomes blind. Ananias prays for him, and Paul is healed. And the fourth and final thing is Paul preaches the good news. Now, that is the sermon. There is no magic to it. It's simply preaching what the text is saying and then drawing your conclusion. I have suggested that the topic of this sermon is Paul's conversion. And if you want to be converted, you need to come like Paul and experience the cross of Jesus, the forgiveness of the cross, and the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, in stories, if you are particularly from the third world, you do not have to learn how to tell a story. You have been naturally taught by your forefathers, your grandmothers, and your aunts and uncles how to tell a story, how to hold suspense, how to give the clue to what you are going and trying to communicate. Now, here are some points on that you might ask when you are preaching from a narrative, or some points. First of all, ask many how and why questions, many why questions. And here it suggests the preacher should give attention to every insignificant detail. Such attention will give a new slant to the story. Now, for example, the woman with the issue of blood. Why did she hide? That is not stated in the text. The reason she hid is she was classified as a leper. Then it says here, look at the cultural context of what is said. The cultural context of this woman is that she is to be secluded and hidden in her home. Stop between explicit action long enough to imagine implicit action. And so you could, by telling the story, you could say this woman was so afraid that somebody could recognize her. She's removing her covering from her eye slightly to recognize her neighbor, and she is afraid that if a neighbor find out that she is in the public, she could be stoned to death. That's what I mean. Use information and experience from your own life to complement the story of being discriminated against if you have in one way or the other. Now move behind the behavior to the motive, ascertain the causative factor involved. For example, what is the motive of this woman who never came to Jesus and asked him for healing? She just touched him.